Just seen this data come through from Ernst Young, and as I said there, FDI increasing 87%. What's the appeal that Africa boasts?
Well, good afternoon, Alicia. As you know, the world has been a global stage where investors had the option to invest in developed and developing markets. But after the, if you like, post-Cold Wars period, Africa has managed to do a lot of structural reforms. Inflation was brought under control. And as you know, regulatory systems were strengthened. Legal systems were made easy for people to do business. It's much easier to sue and be sued in an African court today, unlike 25 years ago. And of course, as you know, the shift in focus towards Africa, the commodities boom, that's another reason. And of course, the fact that Africa now has 1 billion people. Now, if you have 1 billion people, a market of 1 billion people is very hard to ignore.
And of course, that where in most situations we are looking at under-penetration of those markets. The big question, though, Victor, is it sustainable? As other emerging markets ramp up investment appeal and with developed markets still lagging in terms of recovery for now, do we risk seeing just as quick as an outflow as we've seen inflow?
No, remember one thing, Alicia, that this survey did not do. We didn't sit down as Ernst Young and form an opinion. We spoke to 562 business decision makers all over the world, North American, European, Asian, as well as other markets. So it's not something that is based on our opinion. But even into the future, it is expected, as you know, the IMF expects Africa's growth to continue to be above the 5% mark. And of course, the foreign direct investment, these are new projects, not mergers and acquisitions. They're expected to reach about $150 billion. That's a huge growth. That's acceptable, of course, but that you're right, it depends on the growth in developed markets as well as India and China. And as you know, that the growth and the recovery has been seen as something that can be sustained into the future coming after the recession. So yes, it is seen as being sustainable, mainly because the people we spoke to, the businesses that were in Africa, more than 40% of them, 42% actually said they were considering future investments in Africa. That's close to 50% of the respondents. Yeah. And a further 19% said we are already invested in Africa and we are not moving out of the continent. So it's something that you can expect to be sustained into the future, yes.
What's interesting is that we've got other emerging markets taking a growing interest in the continent as well, because, you know, this is a context where we've got developed markets more interested in their own economies, a little bit more ambivalent at this stage of the game. What do you see South Africa doing now that it's got a role in the BRIC nation of economies in fostering this even further?
Yeah, it's still seen South Africa as the most attractive market, of course, because it's seen as the most developed. It's the largest economy on the continent. And you know that most companies coming from the US or coming from Europe, well, even China will see South Africa as the gateway into the rest of the continent. So it is a very important role that South Africa has to play at BRICS to make sure that the agenda of the African continent as a whole is understood. Remember, one thing we also emphasize at Ernst Young at the moment is people should start thinking not just in terms of countries, because some countries can have a very small market, but think of regions, think of East Africa, think of the corridors. Instead of thinking of Nigeria, think of Nigeria, Ghana as a corridor, because there you get a much more advanced, a much more developed market, and it's a much bigger market than if you looked at a smaller country, say, like Benin or Togo.
So that forming then part of how one would assume African markets position themselves in this shifting landscape to accelerate growth and development and avoid getting left behind, Victor, by other emerging markets and regions that boast just as significant growth potential.
Yeah, remember, I mean, in the end, China still offers more growth potential. It still offers better returns at the moment. But the point is, if you look at sustainability into the future, it is not debatable that Africa is the last frontier. And when China has done what it would have been done, in fact, think of it this way. I think the World Bank or the IMF called Africa what China was 30 years ago. So China at one stage was where Africa is. It's just at the moment, 1 billion people, as I say, the changes that are happening, countries that are reforming as much as we've seen them doing, the commodities, the interest in commodities, but most of all, the diversification. It's interesting that investments, the foreign direct investments that we are seeing in Africa are no longer just in extractive industries. They are in business services, they are in ICT, which shows you that Africa is becoming more and more diversified, although commodities are still expected to drive the growth in the future.
Victor, with that being the status of things as they stand now, what role do you see FDI playing moving forward on the continent? continent, because it brings with it then a pull away from dependence on government to develop support mechanisms for economic growth, like infrastructure development, for example?
Remember that foreign direct investments, the way we see it, is a very good generator of growth, is a good creator of jobs. The forecast is that by 2015, just as the forecast says, the FDI should be up to 150 billion US dollars. We're expecting that in that year, you could create up to 350,000 jobs. And as you know, in Africa, you need to create jobs, so you increase the spending power. When you increase the spending power, you create the markets, larger markets, you increase the number of families that have discretionary income, and that way you're going to be able to sustain economic growth rather than depend on government, and worse still, rather than depend on foreign aid.